Hello everyone and welcome to the round 5 recap of the Superbet Chess Classic Romania. In today's round, we had 5 very exciting draws. MVL was playing with the white pieces against Fabiano Caruana. Gukesh was playing against Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Anish Giri was facing Alireza Firouzja. Wesley So was playing against Praggnanandhaa, and Deac Bogdan Daniel was playing against Nepomniachtchi. After today's games, the standings did not change, and we have Fabiano Caruana leading the event with 3.5 points out of 5 going into the rest day. He's closely followed by the 2 Indian players Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh. And those players are closely followed by MVL, Wesley So, Nepomniachtchi, and Alireza Firouzja. At the end, we have Nodirbek Abdusattorov, Anish Giri, and at the very bottom of the table, we have Deac Bogdan Daniel. Without further ado, let's get right into the games. The first game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Maxim Vachier-Lagrave and Fabiano Caruana. MVL starts off the game with 1 e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a Ruy Lopez. a6, bishop a4, knight f6, short castles, and knight takes e4. Black is intending to play the open Spanish with knight takes e4. And after d4, Fabiano Caruana plays the move bishop e7. The main move in this line is the move b5. And this is how the open Spanish lines usually go. But instead, Black chose this interesting move, bishop e7, which is on the slightly rare side. White replies with rook e1, b5, rook takes e4, and pawn goes to d5. Knight takes e5, knight takes e5, rook takes e5, b takes a4, and white played the move queen e2. So far, this position has been reached before, and both players were most certainly familiar with it. Bishop e6, Fabi is playing very quickly, so is MVL. White played f4, g6, knight c3. Slight think from white, but not for much. He only spent around 5 minutes. Black replied quickly with the move a3, expecting the move knight c3, and putting pressure on the queen side on the b2 pawn. White replied with the natural b3, not allowing Black to capture on b2. In this moment, White had this interesting option of playing the move f4, f5, attacking the light squared bishop on e6. If Black were to take this pawn with the bishop, the idea of f5 becomes more obvious. White can play rook takes d5, attacking the queen, and try to bring more attackers on towards the Black king. So instead, Black would most probably reply with g takes f5, having a doubled pawn on the f-file, and in this position, White could react with b3 or perhaps b takes a3, leading to an interesting position. Instead, White played the move b3 after some think. Black replies with bishop b4, knight a4, and already a big time advantage has developed for Black at this point. Fabi plays short castles, c3, bishop drops back to d6, and an exchange sacrifice by the white pieces, offering the rook on e5. And this was the first moment of the game where Fabi actually had to spend some time. If Black were to take the rook on e5, White's idea was going to be to take the bishop with the pawn and try to dominate on the dark squares with something like bishop h6, maybe bring the rook to the f-file, and perhaps try to get the queen to f6 and try to create a kingside attack. And this position would be very dangerous practically for the Black pieces. That's why Fabi decides to not take the exchange and ignore the fact that the rook is hanging for a while. The rook was on e5 until this moment. Rook retreats and takes the pawn, where Black plays rook e8, offering a trade. And we reach the position with opposite colored bishops, where players eventually found the repetition and made the draw. A very solid game by both players. A very exciting exchange sacrifice by MVL, which was not taken by Caruana, and with this draw, he's entering the rest day with a half a point lead in the field. The next game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Gukesh and Nodirbek Abdusattorov. Gukesh started the game off with d4, d5, knight f3, knight f6, and g3. A very solid approach from white. c6, bishop g2, bishop f5, and here he played the move knight h4, trying to win the bishop on f5. Black, of course, does not allow that, drops the bishop back, castles, and goes g6. We have a relatively lesser played territory, I would say, compared to the main line. So this might be because Gukesh is saving his openings, or it might be because he has some novel ideas in this position. So both sides not playing super quickly, but they are still playing relatively fast. White goes rook e1, trying to push the pawn to e4 in the future. Black replies with a5, trying to gain some space on the queen side, which is not allowed by the move a2, a4. Knight d7, e4, few trades happen in the center, and bishop goes to d5. White replies knight takes f6, knight takes f6, bishop drops back to f1. Queen to d7, knight goes to g2, trying to relocate itself on f4 or on e3. Bishop goes to e6, knight goes to f4, and black does not want to give up the bishop pair just yet. Knight goes to d5, queen f3, queen c7. Both sides are more or less shuffling, and white tries to start the kingside attack, which with h2, h4, trying to go h5 and either take on g6 or push h6 and gain some space on the king side. Black does not want any of that, replies with the move h5 himself. Knight lands in the middle of the board, knight e5, pawn goes to e6, queen e2, shuffling, d takes c5, rook a to d8. In this situation, if black were to take this pawn on c5, they would be losing an exchange after this fork, and therefore black was not able to recapture the pawn and instead had to play the move rook a d8, preventing any fork on the d7 square. Knight dropped back to c4, bishop goes to g4, hitting the queen, and then black finally recaptured the pawn. Queen b3 and b6. Both sides are relatively quick at this point, but it's very important to manage your time throughout this time control, which can get very interesting, especially if you spend a lot of time earlier in the game. So both sides are managing their time pretty well, and in this position, white had a very interesting opportunity. After the move bishop f5, white could have played the move knight takes b6. In fact, winning a pawn, at least at the moment. If you take it with the queen, bishop takes d5, defending the queen while regaining the piece that white sacrificed on b6. And if black were to recapture the knight with the knight, then white has this skewer move with bishop to e3, hitting the bishop, hitting the queen and the knight with the bishop. If the queen goes to c4, offering a trade, white can take the knight with the queen and try to pick up another pawn and have a pass pawn on the a file. None of this happened. Perhaps white did not see this opportunity, or maybe considered it but decided that the move bishop g5 was better, as Gukesh spent around 10 minutes in this position. Bishop g5, rook b8, knight e3, and now both sides slightly in the shuffling mode, exchanged the knights. Now we have another piece trade. The queens are off the board, the bishops are off the board, and the position is simplifying with every move the players are making. King dropped back to g7. We have an active rook for white, passive rook for black, but the game is going to liquidate eventually. Both sides are repeating. Now it's a easy rook endgame for black to hold. White is trying to create an outside pass pawn, but black created sufficient counterplay. And the game went on for a little bit longer, but at the end, both sides eventually made a draw by trading all the pieces. Very fighting game, but at the end, there was no one able to win the game. Maybe one opportunity for Gukesh was knight takes b6. Let's move on to the next game. Anish Giri playing with the white pieces and Alireza Firouzja playing with the black pieces. The game started off with d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, and c6, a semi-Slav defense. White plays the move e3, knight bd7, queen c2, bishop d6, b3. These are all pretty standard theoretical lines. This is all still theory, improving the rook, bringing the rook to e1. Anish Giri had almost not spent any time at this point. He's playing very, very quickly, even managed to increment from the starting time. But Firouzja is slightly spending time. Maybe he's not very familiar, or maybe he's just picking his options. He played rook e8, bishop f1. This is a very common break. This is a common drop with the idea to prepare the break with the e4 push. Black replies with e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight d4, threatening to go knight f5, d takes c4, knight f5, queen e6, knight takes, queen takes, rook takes, queen takes, rook d1, c takes b3, and a takes b3. It's very interesting because Anish Giri still was in preparation, and this position has been played several times, but Alireza almost spent an hour to get to this position, more specifically 50 minutes. And this position is relatively known if you are playing the semi-Slav variation. This was a anti-Meran variation with the queen c2 to be specific. So it is interesting to see that, because at this point Giri had a 1 hour advantage, while Firouzja was thinking but finding every single correct move with the black pieces. Bishop takes e5 and queen takes e5. So far, pretty standard, I have to say. So this was the first think of the game where Anish spent 10 minutes and played the move bishop takes e5 and queen takes e5. And in fact, there were 2 games still in this position, but Anish played the move queen takes e5, which I believe is the new move that he actually found on the board. And how I figured that out is that he spent around 40 minutes in total for the last 2 moves, bishop e5 and queen takes e5. So white is slightly bit better because of the passive placement of the rook, but black should be able to hold if things go as planned. Here he played the move b4, which allowed the move a5 and offered a trade where black now had the passed pawn, and eventually this game kept going and made the draw. But I think an interesting attempt could have been to play the move h4, trying to gain some space on the king side, and after a move like a5, perhaps to go bishop to d3, try to go h5, h6, and to open up the black king, while black is also trying to create counterplay, let's say on the queen side. But in this moment, white might have this very nice idea, something like bishop to c2 to drop, to prevent black playing a4. Maybe slight advantage, but still black should be able to hold if things go well. So white eventually managed to pick up a pawn, but now the a pawn is a huge threat that white has to deal with, and eventually this pawn was gone, traded, but then they entered the rook endgame, which was easily held by Firouzja. Very good attempt by white, putting pressure early on the clock, but a great defense by Alireza, making the draw with the black pieces without running into any trouble. Players kept playing, but eventually the repetition happened and it was a draw. Our next game was between Wesley So and Praggnanandhaa, and Wesley started the game off with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, short castles, and knight c3. At this point, it's almost clear that black wanted to play the King's Indian rather than a Grunfeld, because if they did want to play Grunfeld, they would either go d5 or perhaps go c6 first and then d5 and get the simpler, the more solid structure. Of course, he would have to do that before, so that after this, there is no e4. So, but yeah, so black definitely chose the King's Indian in his preparation, and here played this interesting move a7, a5. Usually the standard moves are knight c6, knight vd7, or even a6 I've seen. but a5 is, let's say, lesser of the standard. But now he goes bishop f5, knight h4, bishop drops back. White could have played knight f3, offering a repetition, but Wesley definitely wants more than that. Plays the move b3 and knight bd7 with the idea to go e5. Black goes e5, take, and then knight takes on e5. Queen goes to c2. Very natural developing moves, trying to go rook a d1 and try to maybe start a kingside attack with h3, f4, e4, and so on. Knight drops to c6, rook a d1, bishop d7, h3, rook e8, king h2. White eventually wants to start a kingside attack if possible, but at the same time Black is offering the trade of the bishops to at least get some pieces off the board to slow down this attack. Knight goes to c5, queen c2, knight takes, pawn takes, bishop goes to b5, attacking this pawn on e2. White responds with rook e1, defending the pawn. Bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, a4, knight f3 back, and a takes, knight e4, attacking the f2 pawn. White responds with the move e3, defending the pawn laterally using the queen. Black drops back to d7, queen to c2, c5, en passant, and pawn takes c6. Now Black wants to play the move d5 on the next moves to try to strengthen the knight on e4 and also not have a weakness on the d6 square. But White doesn't want to allow that quickly, so he's putting pressure on the c6 pawn, queen e7, f3, knight c5, e4, gaining space in the center and not allowing the move d5. Rook fb8, putting pressure on b3, f4, trying to prepare the e5 push, rook b4, rook e3, perhaps wants to double up on the e file, goes e5, and then Black replies with d5. Rook c3, putting pressure on the c file, on the knight and the c6 pawn. Knight drops back to e6, knight takes pawn, bishop takes knight, and then rook takes bishop, which temporarily wins a pawn, but of course Black replies with the move rook takes b3. In this position, the tactic looking knight d4, which looks like a fork, does not work, because here White can play the move rook c8 check, and if you take the rook, I take with the queen, and there is no more fork in the position. White would be up material and even winning in this case, because the pawn on d5 is going to drop as well. And if you were to play after rook c8 check, king to g7, now White queen can just go to c7, offer a trade, and White would be up material in this scenario as well. So after rook takes c6, rook takes b3 was played, rook c8 check, and a few trades happened where in this position Black had an interesting option. They played the move queen b4, but they could have played the move queen to a7, threatening queen e3 and some attack on the white king. This was actually a huge opportunity for Pragg to win the game and get tied for first with Fabiano Caruana, but instead he played the move queen b4 in time pressure, missing the opportunity and forcing White to find this only move queen c1 and defending his king side eventually. And after a very fascinating next few moves, the game ended in a perpetual and it was a draw. So what a miss by Pragg on move 39 when both players had less than 5 minutes, and a huge opportunity was missed as queen a7 would probably end the game for White and with a victory for Black. A very fighting game. One opportunity was missed, but at the end the game ended in a perpetual, so it was a draw. The final game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Deac Bogdan Daniel and Jan Nepomniachtchi. This was the longest game of the round, and White started off the game with the move knight f3, d5, g3. We have seen a lot of the knight f3, g3 setups for this round. Knight f6, bishop g2, e6, short castles, bishop e7, c4, castles, and d4. So we transposed into a Catalan opening. D takes e4, d takes c4, queen c2, a6, a4, pretty standard main line of the Catalan. Bishop c6, bishop g5, knight d7, rook d1, h6, bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, knight bd2. Although this is pretty standard, white has actually spent around 20 minutes to get to this position, which means that Deac is probably picking from the variations that he knows during the game as well. So maybe because he was surprised by the choices of black. Queen goes to d6, wants to go to b4 to offer a trade. The light squared bishops were traded. Rook went to c8, preparing the move c5 in some occasions, or c6, or just defending the pawn on c7. Knight f3, c5 was played, d takes c5. The queens came off the board. Knight went to d7. A lot of trades happened early in this game, but then, although this looks like a position that should reach a draw very, very quickly, since both sides are trading the pieces, it didn't end up like that. The game actually had some exciting moments, as we're going to be seeing. So black king is trying to get closer to the white king and maybe perhaps try to get like a mating net going. And white is down to his last minute and a half, and Nepo has over an hour. So he just kept pressing and really hoped that Deac would collapse under pressure. So the e-pawn is now becoming a dangerous pawn. Knight went to f3. Of course, black has repetitions whenever he wants. If he wants to make a draw, he can make a draw, but Nepo really wants to win this game. He's threatening checkmate right now, and it had to be stopped with the move knight g2. King takes pawn. Rook went to g6. So now we're gonna see what ended up happening. So black is pushing and pushing, but there is still no way to make progress. Eventually, black went on to pick up the pawn and has an extra h-pawn, and he kept pushing while Deac was really defending well with no mistakes, holding on to make the draw, and eventually sacrificed his knight on move 62 for that pawn. And now we have a theoretical draw, which is rook and knight versus rook, but black will keep playing this, of course, for 50 moves, and white has to prove that they can make the draw. So the players kept playing. They're just shuffling at this point. White is making sure that he doesn't blunder any sort of forks, and black indeed is hoping to get a fork or an opportunity if possible. So white is correctly just pinning the knight at the moment, and yes, there is absolutely no way to make progress if white is defending it correctly. You can notice that the opposition, whenever black tries to get the opposition, white just doesn't allow that. He is just running away with his king and shuffling, adding time. Of course, there is a lot of pressure at this point, but Deac is doing a really good job of defending this position and had no trouble to defend at the end. And once Nepo was convinced, he actually offered the trade of the rooks as it was approaching 50 moves, and the game ended in a draw. So we had some very fascinating games for the round 5 of the tournament. MVL drawing with Fabiano Caruana, Gukesh drawing with Nodirbek, Anish Giri drawing with Firouzja, Wesley So saving the game, where Pragg really had an opportunity to win the game and catch to the leader. But unfortunately, he was not able to find that opportunity with no time on the clock. And a very exciting draw between Deac, Bogdan, Daniel, and Nepomniachtchi, where Nepo played for hours and hours trying to win the game, but Deac really held on and managed to make a draw. So after round 5, we have Fabiano Caruana leading the event by himself with 3.5 points, closely followed by the Indian players, Praggnanandhaa and Gukesh. And they are closely followed by MVL, Wesley, Nepo, Alireza, and those guys are closely followed by Nodirbek, Anish Giri, and at the very bottom of the table we have Deac, Bogdan, Daniel. So tomorrow is a rest day, so I will hopefully be seeing you all on Tuesday for the recap of round 6. Thank you for watching.